Due to the intense fight, now the place was in ruins. Cyan and Gunther continued with the struggle. Cyan started hitting and Gunther started blocking the attacks. Cyan gave him a strong elbow strike, prepared to hit with his fist, and with a piercing look asked him where Lynn's Nihalof was. Gunther put his arms in front, blocked the attack, and while sweating, clenched his teeth and asked why he was involving this woman now. Gunther got angry, and with an expression full of rage, he asked Cyan not to underestimate him. Using all his strength, he launched a powerful blow, but luckily Cyan jumped and moved at the last second, dodging the attack by a hair. He kept calm, started observing Gunther, and it didn't take long for him to realize that his arm wasn't taking damage from his attacks. Gunther clenched his fist tightly, and with a confident smile asked our boy to try dodging this attack. Using all his strength, Gunther delivered a strong punch to the ground, creating a wave that began to destroy everything in its path into pieces. Cyan dodged the attack again and landed on some wooden debris, and upon seeing that he had evaded the attack, an excited smile appeared on Gunther's face, thinking that he wasn't bad at all. In fact, he was better than Gunther had expected. Cyan landed on the destroyed remains of the house. Gunther started walking toward him and asked him to come down since they were not finished yet. Now that the situation had escalated to this point, Karam asked him if she should interfere. But Cyan's attention turned to one side as he noticed something, asking her to wait since someone else is here. 4 knives descended from the sky and stuck right in front of Gunther, and someone asked him to stop. Gunther was somewhat confused. He began to observe the knives with a confused expression and remained silent. Gunther lost his composure, turned his head toward the direction of the voice, and with a piercing and rage-filled look asked why they were interfering, questioning if they wanted to die. The knives had been thrown by Louisa, who had come along with some guards. She began pointing at him with the knife and with a serious expression demanded to know why he was fighting their client. Gunther got even angrier, clenched his teeth tightly, started pointing at Cyan with his finger, and replied that he had been the one who had started the fight. Louisa did not believe his words, and with an uncertain expression asked him to stop talking nonsense. He replied that he was being serious, asking why she always blamed him for everything. She responded that he was the one who was always causing problems. Cyan began to observe the conversation, and his gaze filled with confusion, wondering if these two already knew each other. Gunther, somewhat furious, turned his back on her and began to walk away with the intention of leaving, but he asked her not to forget about his fight with Simon. She started watching Gunther and remained silent. And upon seeing Gunther's behavior, Cyan was even more confused since this guy was more obedient than he appeared. Louisa, who was somewhat worried, approached Cyan, asking if he was hurt anywhere. Cyan gently descended to the ground and replied that he was fine. Cyan's gaze fixed on her, and with a disappointing expression, he said that he was very displeased. The guards and Louisa panicked. She placed her hands on her abdomen, bowed her head before him, and while sweating explained that he was a VIP client whom they were supposed to take care of. Upon seeing her expression, our boy realized that she had a favor to ask. Upon hearing this, Louisa was somewhat surprised and with a confused gaze asked how he knew this. With a calm voice, Cyan revealed that Gunther had said he had met with the owner to request a fight with him, something he didn't care about at all. At first, Louisa remained silent, but then her eyes and those of the guards filled with surprise. Asking if he was sure, Cyan replied that he had one condition. Cyan began to gaze toward a side where the girl who sold cigarettes was sitting, and asked Louisa to give her a job. The attention of the guards and Louisa turned to one side, and they saw the girl sitting on the ground, trembling and with her eyes full of tears. After a few hours, a man asked his friend if he had heard the news. With a smile, his friend replied that Gunther Lictus was returning to the cage. The man placed his hand under his chin and with a confident look explained that he had heard he was going to fight against Simon Delia. He hadn't thought he'd see Gunther from the dump again, realizing that Simon was in big trouble. Night fell, and Lambaster was full of talks about Cyan's upcoming fight with Gunther. For a week, Cyan had been wandering and fighting a little, learning that there were some rules in the cage. Without much effort, our boy punched his opponent in the face, defeating him and making him fall to the ground. Cyan began to wipe the dust off his shirt with his hand, and the first rule was that weapons were not allowed. The opponent of Cyan lost consciousness, and the second rule was that one must step back if the opponent lost the will to fight. And naturally, the third rule was that one must not kill the opponent. The day of the fight arrived, and the judge of the fight, a blond man wearing glasses, extended his hand toward them and with a smile informed them that for this fight there were no rules since the owner of the cage had allowed it. Gunther, who had his arms crossed, began to smile, while on the other side Cyan was somewhat confused and his mind filled with questions, asking why there were no rules. The judge approached our boy and told him it was exactly as he had heard. This fight had no rules. Cyan was even more confused. He began pointing at himself with his finger, and with an uncertain expression, said that he had not been informed about this. Gunther pulled out brass knuckles, started looking at Cyan, and with a smile explained that Cyan had no idea how long he had been waiting for this fight. Cyan was surprised to see that Gunther had brass knuckles. He got angry, turned to the referee, and told him that this was completely unfair. But to his surprise, the referee disappeared, and Gunther began to smile. The judge announced the beginning of the fight, and Cyan's eyes filled with rage, asking when this bastard had disappeared. The audience went crazy with excitement and everyone started cheering for the fight, and among the crowd was also Lynn, who was eager to see how skilled our boy was. She crossed her arms, and while her body was surrounded by a blue energy, a smile appeared on her face. Gunther put on the brass knuckles and asked Cyan if he hadn't been informed that this fight was going to be a no-rules match. Cyan extended his hand to the side and with a sincere expression replied not entirely. Gunther adopted an offensive stance and used his power, making his arms harden like iron, and with a smile asked him to grab a weapon if he was afraid to fight without one. Cyan, who was somewhat annoyed, closed his eyes, let out a sigh, and decided to fight without a weapon. Cyan extended his hands, making fog appear. He adopted an offensive pose, and with a confident expression said that he had a plan in mind, asking if he was ready to begin. An excited smile appeared on Gunther's face as he was worried about being able to kill him. Cyan did not lose his composure and with a calm expression mentioned that he did not remember this being a fight to the death. Gunther activated his powers, stuck out his tongue, and realized that Cyan had not heard about him. He began to imagine himself holding a skull, and with an exciting smile revealed that it tastes very good to kill a human. Cyan's expression changed upon realizing what Gunther was planning to do. With a look full of hatred, Gunther decided first to take out Cyan's arrogant eyes. Gunther took momentum and in the blink of an eye, appeared in front of Cyan and prepared to hit him. But Cyan reacted in time and dodged the blow without much effort, and then extended his hand and began to summon the demonic sword. Once Gunther let his guard down, Cyan swung the sword with precision and attacked Gunther's arm, not even giving him a chance to react. Cyan's attack was so precise that Gunther's arm went flying. Cyan appeared behind him and while his eyes were glowing, he sheathed the sword. Feeling pain, Gunther opened his mouth and began to scream in agony. All the spectators were in shock. No one could believe what had just happened. Gunther put his hand over his arm and fell to his knees on the ground. His eyes were full of confusion as he did not know what had just happened. With a gaze full of rage, he turned around and swore not to forgive Cyan for this. Cyan turned back and with a threatening look gave him the order not to move if he didn't want to end up truly dead. The arrogant Gunther began to feel a pressure he had never felt before, and following Cyan's order, he did not move. So the referee descended into the ring, and seeing that Gunther was silent, announced Cyan as the winner. The spectators were shocked since no one had seen a fight like this. Gunther had lost very pitifully. A man who had a black mustache began to tremble upon recognizing the black fog and the mysterious mana of Cyan. The man was speechless, and his eyes were full of surprise. His body couldn't help but tremble as he was sure that it was the demonic sword. Cyan arrived at the lounge, and while wiping the sweat off his face with a towel, he realized that someone had made sure he wouldn't get information about the rules of the match, questioning whether perhaps Lynn had figured out what he was trying to do. But just then, the girl that our boy had saved from the clutches of Gunther's subordinates appeared. Her eyes were full of appreciation. She offered our boy a jug of water, saying that the fight had been great. Cyan took the jug of water and was somewhat astonished to see that she had started working. She clenched her fist and excitedly responded that manager Louisa had said she should first start as an assistant. With a smile, she asked our boy to be kind to her. Cyan noticed her uniform and saw that her name was Louis. Cyan sat on the bench, began to stroke her head and with a kind smile asked her to work hard. The girl closed her eyes and started to show a grateful smile. Lisa appeared and upon seeing this, Cyan got angry and with a furious gaze decided to scold her for today's events. But to his surprise, Lisa lowered her head before him and apologized. Cyan began to observe her and was somewhat confused, while on the other side, the girl was somewhat astonished. With a calm expression, Cyan asked why she had hidden that the fight was going to be without rules. She raised her head and with an uncertain look replied that she hadn't hidden anything, as the information had only been shared between the owner and Gunther. She apologized again, saying she should have checked it beforehand. Cyan stood up, closed his eyes, and decided to meet the owner. Lisa panicked and with a trembling voice responded that it wasn't possible since she preferred to remain anonymous. Cyan realized that this method was not going to work, so he turned his head back, and with a serious expression, asked her to be careful from now on. In response, she lowered her head before him and nodded. Once Cyan left the room, someone asked him if he had time. Cyan began observing the man, and his gaze filled with confusion as he asked the man who he was. This man was the same one who had been watching Cyan's fight against Gunther. He placed his hand over his chest, lowered his head before him, and introduced himself as Morris from the Grey Merchants Union. Morris put his hand near his mouth and began to whisper, saying that he had come to see him because he had something interesting. Morris started staring intently at our boy and with a smile asked if he was willing to sell the demonic sword. Cyan entered on alert upon realizing that this bastard knew he had the demonic sword. With a piercing look, he said that he did not know what he was talking about. A confident smile appeared on Morris's face. There was no need to hide it, as he was sure that he was the only one who had recognized it. He used to work for the Albus Merchant Union until Zitcherman Albus, the head of the Albus Merchant Union, was killed 2 years ago. Since then, he had left and had been working for the Grey Trade Union in Lambaster. He put his hand back on his chest, bowed his head to our boy, and mentioned that his specialty was swords and various other weapons. He had been the weapons supplier for the Karam Association even when he was in Albus's trade union. Cyan began to look at the ground with a lost gaze and remained silent. Morris was sure that there was no one who had more knowledge than him when it came to weapons. Morris clenched his fists and his gaze filled with emotion since today he had seen the demonic sword of the Dark Mist. He was sure that it had been waiting for its owner for years and years. Morris approached our boy and asked him to name the price, as he was willing to buy it no matter what. Cyan remained silent in thought for several seconds until Morris's body began to float, and our boy asked if he was the only one who knew. Cyan grabbed Morris by the neck and lifted him off the ground. Now that only he knew about the demonic sword, our boy just needed to get rid of him. Morris panicked, grabbed Cyan's arm with both hands, and foam began to come out of his mouth. But then, a masked man started to emerge from the shadows. Cyan looked to one side and upon noticing this, went on alert. Then, another man emerged from Cyan's shadow, and in the blink of an eye, 3 masked men appeared around him, drew their weapons, and prepared to attack, advising him to release Morris if he didn't want to die. Cyan began staring intently at Morris and with a smile thought this was funny. He lost his composure and his eyes filled with rage. He asked Morris if he really thought he'd be able to stop him with these guys. The men started aiming their weapons at Cyan, ready to attack. Our boy began observing them and it didn't take long for him to realize they were the Shadow Assassins squad of Sparnia. Realizing that Morris had invested a bit in security after the death of Zitcherman Albus, Cyan grabbed Morris's neck tightly and asked him if he really believed these guys were going to be able to save him before he broke his neck. Morris began to run out of air, clenched his teeth tightly, and his eyes filled with fear. Lisa and the girl entered the room, and upon seeing this, Lisa was left speechless and couldn't help but go on alert, while on the other hand, the girl put her hands over her mouth in shock. Lisa drew her daggers and with a confident expression asked the men what they were trying to do to their guest, advising that it would be better to resolve this with words since otherwise she would have to use force. Upon hearing her voice, Cyan turned around and saw Louise with eyes full of worry and tears. Cyan began to observe her and thought that this could also drag her in. For him, this was very annoying. Cyan let go of Morris's neck, causing him to start gasping heavily. With a suffocating expression, our boy decided to forgive him this time, telling him to go to hell before he changed his mind. The men went on alert, and one of them asked Morris what to do now. Morris put his hand on his neck, and while he was catching his breath, he gave the order to put away the weapons. The men put away the weapons. Morris, who had his hand on his neck, approached Cyan and realized that he must be a little upset, so he decided it was better to leave. Cyan's gaze fixed on him. He didn't know what this guy was trying to do. Morris put his hand on his chest, lowered his head, and with a smug smile said that the offer was still on the table, advising him to think carefully. After saying this, Morris and his men turned their backs on our boy and began to leave the place. Cyan started staring at them intently and remembered that the Grey Merchants Union was a new organization formed as a consequence of Zitcherman Albus's death. While our boy was distracted, the girl who was very worried about him approached and asked if he was okay. Cyan turned back and with a serene expression replied yes. With tears in her eyes due to fear, the girl explained that those people were very terrifying. Cyan placed his hand on top of her head and asked her not to worry, making the girl calm down. While stroking the girl's head, he began to look at Lisa and said that he had a favor to ask her. Lisa's expression filled with curiosity, asking what favor he wanted to ask. With a piercing gaze, our boy revealed that he wanted to meet the owner of Lambaster Cage. Upon hearing this, Lisa's eyes filled with concern and surprise. She didn't know what to say. At the same time, in the slums of the city, Gunther, who was very angry, began destroying everything. Seeing this, his men couldn't help but worry and asked him to calm down since otherwise his wound would reopen. Gunther now had the wound caused by Cyan bandaged. He was very furious, and with eyes thirsty for revenge, he began to shout Cyan's name. He clenched his teeth tightly, and with a murderous look, he started to feel that he would die if he didn't kill Cyan. He began to remember the fight and the piercing gaze of our boy. At that moment, Gunther had felt powerless in front of a child. Due to the frustration, he fell to his knees on the ground and put his hand on top of his face, thinking of some way to bring down Cyan. Now this was the only thought he had. At that moment, the image of the girl who sold cigarettes came to Gunther's mind. He removed his hand from his face and his eyes filled with hope. A smile appeared on his face, realizing that he could bring down Cyan using the girl. He took out a card from the Grey Guild that he had in his pocket, and an idea came to his mind. Some hours later, back at the Lambaster Cage, the girl was working carrying some towels. At that moment, slowly the door began to open. Her attention fixed on the door, and she was surprised to see that a customer had come. The customer started showing an evil smile and greeted the girl, and upon seeing who it was, her eyes filled with fear, causing her to start sweating. The client was none other than Gunther. He approached her, crouched down, placed his hand on top of her head, and with a terrifying smile asked if she remembered him. Upon hearing this, she began to tremble with fear and couldn't help but feel terror, responding that yes. Gunther started laughing like a madman and with a desperate expression asked if she could help him. At the same time, Cyan and Lisa were on the second floor. Cyan, who had his back against the wall, extended his hand toward her and asked why he couldn't meet with her, explaining that he had to file an official complaint. Lisa crossed her arms and revealed that she was not someone he could easily get to know. With a calm gaze, he asked why she was defending Lynn's Nihalof so much. Lisa couldn't help but go on alert, and her attention turned to him. Seeing that he knew the name Lynn's, she realized that he was not an ordinary person. Cyan began observing her in silence, and she revealed that Lynn's was also watching him. She had been the one who allowed the fight with Gunther and also the one who had changed the rules of the fight. With a serious expression, she decided to warn him about something, asking him to leave this place, as otherwise he could end up dead. Instead of getting nervous, our boy remained calm. He was somewhat confused since he didn't know which side she was on, not knowing if she was so loyal to her job. At that moment, screams began to be heard, catching the attention of Cyan and Lisa. She went on alert and couldn't help but start feeling afraid since it was Louisa's voice and it came from the lobby. Lisa, somewhat worried, started to go down the stairs at full speed, and upon reaching the first floor, they saw a large hole in the wall, with the reception desk destroyed. Seeing this, Lisa couldn't help but wonder who could have done this. Cyan began to investigate the area. He crouched down and found something. He picked it up with his hand and realized who might have been responsible. Lisa, who was behind him, turned around and with a curious look asked what that was. Cyan found a badge with blood, and upon inspecting it, he realized it belonged to Louise. He put the badge in his pocket, stood up, and decided to go look for her, asking Lisa to stay here. Hearing this, Lisa panicked and couldn't help but be open-mouthed. Somewhat worried, she asked him to wait since they didn't even know who was responsible. At that moment, she began to feel an immense pressure, leaving her in shock. Cyan turned his head back and, with a piercing gaze full of rage, mentioned again that he knew who the culprit was. At the same time, somewhere else in the city, there were a bunch of portraits scattered everywhere. It was Delia's room. Someone entered and explained that a lady's room shouldn't be so messy. Delia was tired and lying on the bed with an expression full of sleep. She asked the person who had entered her room without permission if they wanted to die. It was Morris, who put his arms behind his back and with a smile said that she was a mess. Delia lifted her head and upon seeing him, asked what he was doing there. Morris started walking towards her and asked if it wasn't obvious why a merchant was here, explaining that he had come with an offer. She began to ignore him, saying that she didn't like pigs. Morris grabbed one of the portraits, started observing it, and realized that she had fallen in love with that boy whose face she couldn't remember. This sparked Delia's curiosity. She began looking at Morris, asking what he knew about this. Morris put his hand inside his pocket and decided to get straight to the point. He took out a small bottle that contained a potion, began to show it to her, and with a confident smile mentioned that it was the most potent paralyzing potion that existed in the kingdom of Karam. With this, she could have that boy. Delia did not get up from the bed, and while still lying down, extended her hand to take the potion and with a curious look asked what Morris wanted in return. He closed his eyes and a smile appeared on his face. He only wanted one thing that the boy possessed, and she could keep the body. She began to inspect the potion, asking if that was really all. Morris started to move away from her, extended his hand to one side and said yes, he would be waiting eagerly. Morris left the room with an evil smile. He didn't care who that guy was, he just needed to get rid of Simon. He only wanted the sword. For now, he decided to wait for Gunther to take care of him. At the same time, in the city's slums, Gunther was sitting on top of a coffin. He couldn't help but smile upon seeing that Simon Lemia had come. Cyan, who was standing in front, decided to get straight to the point by asking where the girl was. Gunther took something out of the coffin, threw it toward him, and with a smile told him that this was a keepsake. The object that Gunther had thrown fell near Cyan. It was an ear covered in blood, and upon seeing this, Cyan's gaze filled with fear, thinking the worst. With a smug smile, Gunther began to touch the coffin with his hand, indicating to our boy that the rest was inside, asking him to dare to try and take it. Cyan began releasing energy and with a revenge-thirsty smile asked why Gunther hadn't said earlier that he wanted to die. Gunther understood the signal, started using his power, and some kind of slimy energy began forming on his arm that Cyan had cut off during the fight. He started smiling like a madman saying that's what he wanted, and asked him to come at him. In the lambaster cage was Lynn sitting. With a smile she asked if Gunther was going to kill Cyan. In front of her was Louisa, who placed her hands on her abdomen, started looking at the ground and responded that no. Seeing her expression, Lynn asked if she was worried about him. Louisa explained that it had been a long time since she had lost any attachment she had towards him. She felt curious, so she asked why she was so obsessed with Simon. Lynn rested her head on her hand and with a serene expression decided to calm her down, asking if she remembered Cyan's face. Upon hearing this, Louisa was shocked and her eyes filled with surprise. She began trying to remember Cyan's face, but no matter how much she tried, she was unable to. With a confused look, she began to wonder why she couldn't remember his face. Lynn began to show the ring she wore on her finger, which started to emit a powerful red fog, revealing that it was one of Eru's authorities, the ability to make people forget the user's face. Upon hearing the name Eru, Louisa was in shock, asking if she was referring to the god of darkness. Lynn began to smile, affirming that yes, she realized that her past had found her. Louisa panicked and with a surprised look asked if she was in danger, but Lynn replied that she was not. She placed her hand on her chest and with a confident look explained that it had been a long time since they had such a valuable guest, so she asked Louisa to treat the client as appropriate. At the same time, Gunther's arm regenerated and was now made of blood. With a look full of excitement, he started running towards Cyan asking if he was ready. He put his hand on the ground and began to move it forcefully, and using all his power, he launched a powerful attack towards Cyan. Our boy had no time to react and his body was thrown backward. Cyan planted his feet on the ground to try to stop his moving body, and several seconds later he managed it. Gunther stomped hard on the ground and asked why he wasn't using that ability from before. He started staring intently at Cyan and with a smile asked him to try harder. Cyan looked to one side and was shocked to see human remains. The fight was unearthing all the human remains in the area. Gunther began to bring his hand closer to the ground and picked up a skull, asking Cyan if he knew why these things were here, revealing that it was because they were useless and this place was a junkyard. After picking up the skull from the ground, Gunther broke it into pieces and with an evil look revealed that Lambaster was full of trash. He started to remember his past, Louisa, and he used to live among the trash, being mocked by everyone. But even so, he would stand in front of her to defend her. When he grew up a little, he got into trouble, being beaten many times, having to do everything possible in this hellish place to survive. He had been forced to bite anyone who tried to lay a hand on them, and then he met a boy. The boy drew a sword and began pointing it at the neck of one of the men, making him panic. The man, fearing for his life, started begging for mercy. But the boy ignored him and coldly thrust his sword into his chest, ending his life. Behind him, there were more corpses. Seeing this, Gunther and Louisa, who were scared out of their minds, were shocked since that boy had eliminated the manager of the junkyard depot, who used to harass them all the time. After killing everyone, the boy sheathed his sword and began walking toward them. That boy had said he left Lewin Academy to look for some fun here, and had cleaned up all the trash from the junkyard depot. It was none other than Ashel. He extended his hand toward them and with a kind smile told them that now they could be safe since all the trash had been cleaned up. Seeing this, Gunther's eyes filled with surprise and admiration. He couldn't forget that angelic face of Ashel, and from then on, he decided to admire him, and after that day his life changed. He began to dream of the day when he would dispose of all the trash in Lambaster, and little by little he expanded his strength and even became the manager of the junkyard. He started massacring everyone in the Lambaster cage to earn money. He had ended up killing his opponent and had been expelled, but even so, he kept showing a confident smile because he didn't care. The person he had killed was just trash that he needed to dispose of anyway. That fact made Lisa turn her back on Gunther and cut contact with him. But even so, he didn't care and kept smiling because he was one with the junkyard. His eyes filled with excitement at the thought that one day he would dispose of all the trash from Lambaster. That was his goal. Cyan decided that it was time to stop the nonsense. Upon hearing this, Gunther's expression changed. He couldn't help but be shocked. Cyan stood up and with a proud smile asked if he couldn't see that he was perfectly fine, mocking Gunther and asking him to try a little harder. Gunther started looking at Cyan and couldn't help but feel excitement since this was exactly what he wanted to hear. He decided to give everything he had. Gunther activated his ability called Scaples, causing the viscous energy to start attracting everything metallic, from chains and gears to debris, which began fusing with his arm. He took out a purple cube, and while his arm was transforming, he started walking towards Cyan and decided to show him something more interesting. With a calm look, Cyan began observing the purple cube in his hand and realized it was an ancient relic. He didn't know where Gunther had gotten an artifact like that. Gunther began to use his power, making the cube start to float. With a smile, he revealed that this was called Gravity Chamber. The cube started to activate and then closed abruptly. It could create a mana room from a location chosen by the user. The cube became enormous and fell on top of Cyan, trapping his body inside, causing him to feel immense pressure, leaving him in shock. This artifact could multiply gravitational force by 20 times. Gunther prepared to attack, and upon seeing that Cyan was still standing and holding up quite well, he couldn't help but start smiling. He decided to see if he could withstand the next attack. Gunther's hand became enormous, and while the cube was exerting immense pressure on our boy, Gunther prepared to crush him. Now that Cyan was in this situation, Karam asked if he wanted help, but he remained calm and replied no, as there was no need. With a look full of rage and vengeance, he said that he didn't need anyone's help. Then, he moved at great speed. With a smug smile, Gunther launched the attack on Cyan with the intention of crushing him, without realizing that he was no longer inside the cube. Our boy moved quickly and appeared near Gunther, and without him being able to notice or have time to react, he gave him a strong punch in the chest. Gunther was in shock, and with a confused look he began to wonder what had just happened. According to him, it should be difficult for Cyan to even move. Cyan's blow was so strong that Gunther's arm began to disintegrate, causing all the metal to start falling to the ground, and his body was thrown into the air. He couldn't believe this was happening. While Gunther was in the air, Cyan appeared above him and with a piercing gaze prepared to attack again. Upon feeling the presence of our boy, Gunther couldn't help but go on alert. Cyan started staring at him intently and revealed that he was going to crush everything except his ears. Feeling his gaze made Gunther start to feel fear, and he couldn't help but begin sweating like crazy. Cyan first gave him a strong kick in the back, and right then delivered a hard elbow strike to the abdomen, causing his body to be flung toward the ground. While his body was falling, Cyan threw 6 sharp objects at him, which embedded in his body, causing him terrible pain. Gunther's body hit the ground hard, creating a large curtain of smoke. Now his body was lying on some rubble and there were sharp crystals embedded in his body. Cyan descended to the ground and approached him. With blood coming out of his mouth, Gunther's gaze fixed on our boy, and with a smile he accepted defeat, knowing that he was destined to die from the beginning. Cyan clenched his fist, began looking down, and remained silent. Gunther mentioned that he had no regrets, mocking him by saying that girl had been born in Lambaster, so she was destined to become trash. With his last breaths, Gunther began to show a confident smile, revealing that the girl was destined to die just like him and Lisa, since that was the rule of this city, made by the owner. He asked our boy to make sure that this didn't happen, being confident that he could do it. Upon hearing this, Cyan couldn't help but go into shock and alertness, not knowing what was really happening. Not long after, Gunther began bleeding out even more and within seconds lost his life. Cyan looked to one side and his attention fixed on the coffin. He started walking over the debris until he reached the coffin. Very carefully, he opened the lid and was shocked to see what was inside. Not long after, Lisa and her men arrived at the area, and she was somewhat confused to see that everything was in ruins. Looking a little closer, she saw Gunther's lifeless body lying in the middle of the junkyard. At first, she remained silent. She was concerned that this had happened. She turned to the man and with a serious look asked him to make sure the VIP client was safe. The man closed his eyes and bowed his head before her. At that moment, someone caught their attention, and upon hearing this, Lisa and the man turned their heads to one side and were somewhat surprised. It was Cyan who took the girl's body out of the coffin, and seeing that he was alive, Lisa, somewhat worried, asked him what he was doing. Her eyes filled with surprise. She could not believe what her eyes were seeing. Cyan, who was holding the girl's body, turned his head toward her and with a sincere expression explained that she wasn't hurt anywhere and was just sleeping. Lisa approached Cyan along with the guards, sat on the ground, and took the girl's body. With a worried look, she asked if he was okay, to which he replied that he was fine and asked her to take good care of the girl. Then, he stood up, turned his back to them, and clenched his fist tightly. Seeing this, Lisa couldn't help but panic and with a confused look asked where he was going, to which he replied that he was going to clean. Upon hearing this, Lisa became even more confused and with an uncertain expression asked what he was going to clean. Cyan began to move away from them and with a look full of vengeance revealed that he was going to clean Lambaster. There were 4 districts in Lambaster, with Lambaster Cage at its center. The junkyard was located to the west, the commercial district to the east, and the entertainment district to the south. There was no establishment in charge of the city's security, causing the strong to start abusing the weak. However, there was still a small system in place to maintain rules in the city, and this system was managed by the administrators of each district. Among them were Lynn, Morris, Delia, and Gunther. In his past life, while Cyan was walking behind his brother, he asked how he was going to conquer a place like that, explaining that if it were a normal country, they could simply declare war on them, but since it wasn't a normal country, they couldn't do that. He asked if it would be better for him to go alone and take care of the city administrators. Ashel started smiling and replied that it wasn't necessary, leaving our boy somewhat confused. With a confident look, Ashel explained that they were going to destroy themselves even if they did nothing. They just had to arrive in time to take control. Upon hearing this, Cyan became suspicious and asked him how he could be so sure. Ashel turned around, started staring at him intently, and revealed that the city was rotten, something he had seen with his own eyes. Cyan was still bothered by how confident his brother seemed back then, but now he realized that he was right. Cyan went to the entertainment district, where everyone was having fun. And upon seeing this, our boy realized that this city was rotten to the core. With a determined look, he set himself the goal of uncovering its roots today. He entered the establishment, where he was greeted by Delia. They went to a discreet room and she offered him a cup of tea, and then sat next to him, grabbing him by the arm. The cup of tea was emitting a strange energy. It had a sweet and minty aroma, and although it was supposed to be a cup of black tea, it was as if she wasn't even trying to hide that this tea had drugs. He began to observe the cup of tea and became somewhat confused since it had the aroma of a very popular paralysis medicine in Karam. Delia began to touch her hair with her hand and, with a nervous voice, thanked him for responding to her invitation. She was sure that he was going to enjoy this night. Cyan brought the cup of tea close to his mouth, started observing it, and with a smile responded that he was going to enjoy this night just like this tea which had a very special aroma. Upon hearing this, she was in shock. With a worried expression, she realized that something was not right, not knowing if he had noticed that she had put something in the tea. Cyan began to stare at her intently and said that he was looking forward to enjoying this night. Without wasting a second, he lifted the teacup and started drinking, and upon seeing this, she was somewhat confused and surprised at the same time, unable to believe that he was actually drinking at all. Then, not long after, he threw the cup on the floor, breaking it into pieces, and fainted onto Delia's shoulder. She began to look at our boy with a surprised expression and couldn't help but go into shock. A proud smile appeared on her face, thinking that now this boy belonged to her. At the same time in the commercial district, the news about Delia having managed to capture Simon reached the Grey Merchant Union. The butler placed his hand on his chest and informed Morris that this was a message from the entertainment district. Morris, who was dining calmly, couldn't help but feel happy, thinking that God was on his side today. With an angry gaze, he thought it was a shame that Gunther had wasted the gravity chamber, since he had worked very hard to obtain it from the Karam Association. To calm himself a little, he grabbed a chicken thigh and took a strong bite, and his eyes filled with excitement, thinking that soon the demonic sword would be his. One of his men emerged from a portal and with a suspicious look said it was a bit suspicious that things were going so well. Morris closed his eyes and nullified the bad luck. The man began to stare at him intently, revealing that his instinct had never been wrong. They decided to go there in advance to explore the place. Morris turned his head back and with a serious expression gave him permission to go, but asked him not to do anything unnecessary, to which he responded yes, and then began to disappear, entering the portal. Morris continued enjoying his meal, thinking that the stupid bastards from Sparnia were very annoying, as they were meddlers. According to him, they should do the job they were paid for. With a suspicious look, he began to wonder if they also wanted his demonic sword. Several minutes later, someone went out to the city and began asking everyone to get out of the way, leaving all the residents in shock. It was none other than Morris, who was riding in his carriage and was speeding towards the entertainment district. A while later, he arrived at Delkia's establishment, and with an enthusiastic smile, he opened the door, announcing that he had already arrived. Delkia took Cyan, who was unconscious, to her room and left him on her bed. She sat next to him and with a smile said that Morris had arrived early. According to her, he could have taken a little longer. She began to blush, stuck out her tongue, started touching it with her finger while explaining that the fun was about to begin. Upon hearing this, Morris also began to blush and with a cheerful look explained that he didn't need Cyan's body. He only wanted the object that he had. Delkia crossed her arms and explained that she had already taken that away from him. Upon hearing this, a big smile appeared on Morris's face since that was all he wanted. He was impatient, so he extended his hand toward her for her to hand over the object. But at that moment, Delkia pulled a rope and asked Morris not to rush so much because he was going to be very surprised. The curtains began to move, revealing someone who had their arms tied by red fog and a man with white hair. Upon seeing this, Morris panicked and couldn't help but start sweating and feeling fear. Once the curtains moved, the bodies of several men appeared, and in the middle was Delkia's unconscious body tied by her wrists. She extended her hand toward them and asked if what Morris wanted wasn't right here. Observing a little more closely, Morris finally realized what she had been hiding behind the curtains. She had been dissecting humans. Looking at what was in the middle, Morris began to tremble with fear. It was Delkia's body tied by her hands and with bruises on her face. Morris went on alert, turned towards the fake Delkia and with a confused look asked who she was. She began to show a smile, asking him not to be so rude. She started passing her hand over her face, making the disguise begin to disappear. She was none other than Karam. Once her true form appeared, she began staring at Morris, and with a smile revealed that she was the demonic sword he wanted so much. Seeing this, Morris was left with his mouth open, and not long after fell on his butt to the ground, unable to believe that the demonic sword could turn into a human. Karam simply began to smile, and at that moment, Cyan, who was pretending to be paralyzed, woke up, started staring intently at Morris and thought that he knew too much. And upon hearing his voice, Morris began to feel fear, knowing he was in trouble. Morris closed his eyes and with all the air he had in his lungs started screaming and calling for help from the Shadow Assassin's squad. His screams were so loud that Cyan put his hands over his ears and thought this guy was very noisy. Just before Morris could keep shrieking, Cyan gave him a strong blow to the neck, asking him to shut up. Morris fell to his knees on the ground. Cyan stood up, began rolling up his sleeves and seeing how much he wanted to see those guys, he decided to send him to meet them. Cyan extended his hands to the sides and began releasing a powerful fog, and then used the space creation ability called Swamp of Mist. At that moment, Morris's shadow started turning into fog, making him panic, and not long after, the shadow started consuming his body. Cyan approached, began to stare at him intently and assumed that he had been the one who had given the artifact to Gunther and the paralyzing medicine to Delkia. The shadow began to consume Morris's body, and he started begging for mercy, promising that he would never do it again. Cyan started smiling and said that he was going to make sure Morris could never do something like that ever again, and bid him farewell. Morris's body began to enter the shadow. In a desperate attempt, he started to extend his hand upward, pleading to be forgiven. Morris entered the shadow, which seemed to be some kind of lake. Something collided with Morris's body, leaving him somewhat confused. With a look full of fear, he turned to one side to see what it was. It was the lifeless body of one of the assassins from the shadows. Morris put his hands on his neck as he began to run out of air. Morris's shadow started to disappear, and Cyan turned to one side, remembering that now only Delkia was left. Karam began to approach her and asked Cyan to leave since she was going to take care of Delkia. Cyan decided to listen to her, but with a worried look asked her not to cross the line. Karam started smiling and promised not to do so. She approached Delkia, put her hand on her waist, asking how she had dared to lay her hands on her owner. Delkia, whose face was full of bruises, slowly began to regain consciousness. Karam's eyes filled with emotion upon seeing this. She started cracking her fingers and with a smile said that she knew she was awake, telling her to prepare because she was going to divide her body into 1,000 pieces. Delkia began to cry and her body started trembling. She began begging for forgiveness, swearing never to try something like that again. Karam paid no attention and gave her a strong punch in the face, making her start screaming in pain. Cyan left the room, and upon hearing the screams, his attention fixed on the door, realizing that Karam was going to beat her to a pulp. His expression turned serious. He started looking to one side and went on alert upon sensing a familiar mana. At that moment, his eyes filled with surprise. He couldn't believe what was in front of him. He appeared in a completely different place. Upon observing his surroundings, he didn't take long to realize that he was in a domain of the fog. A blue fog began to emerge from nowhere, and someone found our boy's expression very amusing. Cyan panicked and couldn't help but feel afraid, realizing that this was not good. The blue fog began to gather in the sky. It was Lynn, one of Lambaster's managers. Cyan started observing the fog in silence. Several seconds later, she emerged from the fog and began descending to the ground. Cyan was surprised and couldn't help but feel fear upon seeing that she was also part of mist. Lynn began to look at Cyan with a calm gaze and started to smile, assuming that Sarika had not spoken about her, realizing why he was going around killing the other city managers. She descended to the ground. Cyan extended his hand and began to release fog, thanking her for her consideration since now he didn't have to go looking for her. Cyan's eyes filled with emotion, and with a smile he asked if he should refer to her as senior colleague, but then mocked by saying she was more like a traitor. Lynn started to show her ring and with a confident smile asked our boy not to misunderstand her since it was not going to be her who was going to fight. At that moment, something began approaching Cyan at great speed. Upon feeling this, he turned around and couldn't help but go on alert. Someone appeared and tried to attack Cyan, but our boy reacted in time and deflected the attack just in time. He went on alert upon seeing that there was a third person. With a smile, Lynn asked him to say hello. Upon seeing who this person was, Cyan was shocked and began to sweat. While Lynn's body was emitting a powerful energy, she started looking at Cyan, asking if they already knew each other. This person was none other than Louisa. She adopted an offensive stance, and her gaze full of hatred fixed on Cyan. She began to show the knife and with a piercing look swore to eliminate Simon now. Louisa began to attack Cyan. He wrapped his hands in fog and blocked the attack. Louisa did not stop and kept attacking. Cyan started blocking and panicked. With a desperate look, he asked her to step aside since he had unfinished business with Lynn, revealing that this had nothing to do with her. Louisa did not change her thoughts, and with a piercing gaze, she launched another powerful attack again, and upon seeing this, our boy realized that she was not listening. While the eyes of our boy were shining, he started to run towards her and decided to knock her out since there was no other choice. He used the secret technique called Wave of Bloodthirst, joined his hands and launched a powerful burst of energy towards her, which struck her body making her fly backward. Despite having received the attack, she continued as if nothing had happened. She placed her hand and feet on the ground and stopped her moving body. Upon seeing that the attack had no effect, Cyan began to smile and couldn't help but feel somewhat surprised, realizing that she had been trained very thoroughly. She started to stand up, and her gaze fixed on our boy. She was so strong that she had been able to withstand the Bloodthirst Wave technique. Lynn, who had her arms behind her back, approached our boy and with a smile asked why he had hesitated, knowing he could have killed her if he wanted. Cyan began to look at her with a calm gaze, asking how much longer she planned to hide in the fog. She started to show an exciting smile, explaining that she just wanted to test the skills of the boy Sarika had trained. She wanted to know who would win if he fought against Louisa, who had been trained by her. Upon knowing that she knew Sarika, Cyan became serious, questioning what the relationship between them was. Lynn began to disappear, reminding our boy that he had something else to focus on right now. Upon hearing this, Cyan snapped out of his trance and went on alert. Louisa used the ability called Rain of Needles, making several knives emerge. She started staring intently at Cyan and prepared to attack. She launched the attack toward our boy, but he began moving quickly, did a backflip, and dodged the attacks without much effort. While Cyan was getting up, Louisa took advantage of this moment, jumped, appeared in the sky, and prepared to attack again. Using all her strength, she attacked again. But Cyan once more wrapped his hands in mana, put his arms in front of his head and blocked the attack. Louisa's hands began to tremble, and with a look full of hatred she mentioned that she had cut ties with Gunther, but he was going to have to pay for having taken away her last remaining relative. Cyan, who was holding the blade of the knife with his hands, remained calm and realized that they were connected more deeply than just as acquaintances. Cyan's attention fixed on Lisa's eyes, realizing that the subordination of the Shadow's personality had been activated. Lynn had used a small memory fragment to plant resentment in her. It had been a mistake to close the distance between them. Cyan moved at great speed, and just before she had time to react, he grabbed Lisa by the neck, leaving her in shock. He threw Lisa on her back against the ground, got on top of her, and using his hand made her drop the knife, causing her to panic. Just before she had time to react, Cyan grabbed her by the neck and with his other hand gave her a strong blow to the head. And not long after, she lost consciousness. Cyan felt relieved since knocking her out had been a success. With an angry look, he mentioned that now only the two of them were left, asking Lynn why she wasn't coming out. She began to manifest in the sky in the form of mist, and with a smile she asked what he was talking about. She was sure that he already knew that this domain of fog was her. He started to observe her and mentioned that he had been surprised by the fact that she was fog, but even more by the fact that she was a traitor and a thief. Upon hearing this, she couldn't help but feel somewhat confused since she didn't know what Cyan was talking about. He began pointing at her with his finger and with a smile explained that the ring she was wearing on her finger was the Ring of Anbari, an artifact that allowed one to absorb anything, whether it be mana or divine authority. He realized that she was using the ring to pretend to be fog. Lynn's gaze filled with alertness and confusion. Cyan started touching his neck with his hand, and a confident smile appeared on his face. Even though he didn't know how she had obtained it, he was sure that she was an imposter. Lynn lost her composure. She began to show the ring, which started to emit a powerful blue fog. With a furious and emotional look, she gave the order to submit under absolute power. Cyan remained calm, realizing that she had fallen into the trap. She used the Black Mist God power ability called Mist, causing the ring to start creating a powerful barrier. The barrier began to expand everywhere, and just before Cyan had time to react, he was trapped inside along with Lisa, leaving him in shock. Lynn descended to the ground, revealing that this was a realm only she could enter, being the only one who could move within it. She approached Cyan and with a confident smile asked how it felt to be imposing, revealing that this was what real power was. She extended her hand backward and began to summon a dagger, saying that it was time to say goodbye to this world. But then, someone felt happy to have found her, without knowing what this small realm was. Upon hearing this, Lynn's eyes filled with fear and confusion, not knowing what was happening. A crack began to form behind her, and upon noticing this, she couldn't help but start sweating and feeling terror. Karam opened the portal with her hands, started staring at her and couldn't help but get angry upon seeing that she was also chasing her master. Lynn tightly gripped the dagger, turned around, and upon seeing Karam, she couldn't help but fall into confusion. She couldn't believe that she had interrupted her realm, realizing that she was as strong as the god of the Black Mist. Her gaze fixed on Karam, and she went on alert upon realizing that apart from Eru there was only one other person. After giving Delia a good beating, Karam opened a rift and entered inside. She placed her hand on her hip, started walking toward her, and with a smile asked why people kept chasing what was hers, and also into how many pieces she wanted to be cut. Lynn didn't take long to recognize the demonic sword Karam. Karam's gaze fixed on her, and with a confident grin, she snapped her fingers and decided to first destroy this realm. At that moment, cracks appeared in Lynn's realm, and not long after, the barrier that the ring had created began to shatter into pieces. She began to look up, and upon seeing this, she couldn't help but panic. She couldn't believe that Karam had destroyed her realm so easily. Her power stopped taking effect, freeing Cyan. He began to look at her and with a calm gaze asked why Karam had taken so long. She couldn't help but get angry like an ogre without knowing why he was complaining even when she had saved him. Cyan put his hands on his hips and started scolding her, saying it could have been dangerous. Lynn lost her composure, reached out to the side, and with a furious expression told her to shut up, as there was no way Cyan could be the successor. She clenched her fist tightly and mentioned that there hadn't been one in 300 years, so there was no way a child like him could have been chosen. Karam put her hand near her mouth and with a confused expression asked Cyan what was wrong with her. Cyan started looking at her and replied that he had already made her angry before. Lynn's gaze filled with fury upon seeing that he was nothing more than a child. She began to move toward them with the intention of attacking, clenched her teeth, and asked not to be underestimated by calling him a false successor. Karam's gaze fixed on her, and little by little she began to disintegrate, asking why she was so angry. She transformed into the demonic sword. Cyan grabbed it, prepared to defend himself from the attack, and with a smile assumed that she was not going to be a good assassin with that kind of behavior. Both began to move at great speed. Using the accelerating Mist Storm ability, they started swinging their swords forcefully, attacking each other. Due to the difference in strength, her body was thrown backward until she fell on her back against the ground and dropped the dagger. Her dagger stuck in the ground, while our boy's body was surrounded by a powerful energy. He began to stare at her and with a smile asked if she still didn't believe him. Karam decided it was time to show her true authority. Several seconds later, Lynn sat on the ground, and Cyan used the power of the black mist, and upon hearing this, her gaze filled with surprise, leaving her in shock. Looking to one side, she saw our boy. He extended the sword toward the sky, creating a great ball of energy. Now he wore a mask made of fog. He began to stare at her and asked her to try to block this attack with her stupid ring. Lynn swallowed hard and couldn't help but feel fear, realizing that this was not good. Cyan extended the sword toward her, causing the energy ball to shoot out at her, which began destroying everything in its path. Lynch, defenseless, started watching as the energy ball was approaching without being able to do anything. A few years ago, in the Black Mist Temple, Sarika asked if she was going to leave. Lynch turned her back on her and with a confident expression replied that she was tired of waiting for the successor in this place. Sarika remained calm and with a tranquil expression accepted her decision, thinking it was a shame. With a cheerful smile, Lynch turned around, asking if she was going to come to kill her. Sarika's attention fixed on her, responding that she wasn't going to because there was no reason. There were other bad people she needed to get rid of, asking her not to worry. With a suffocating gaze, she made one thing clear: the moment she became contaminated, she herself was going to purify her. Lynch couldn't help but feel fear upon seeing her expression. If that moment came, then she would also take all the equipment she had stolen. This was something no one knew now, so Sarika asked her not to worry about it. With a piercing expression, she asked Lynch to take care of herself. Upon hearing this, a smile appeared on her face, and in this way, she said goodbye to Sarika. She turned her back on her teacher and began to walk away. She left the organization that held power but remained hidden in order to create an organization of her own where the powerful would be recognized. She did not want to stay hidden forever waiting for the successor. Back to the present, Cyan's attack cut her fingers, causing her body to start trembling. The attack had been so powerful that she had a hole in her body. She didn't know how this had happened, believing she had come so far. Not long after, she fell to the ground, and upon seeing this, Cyan began deactivating his power, and with a serene expression asked if she had any last words to say. She lowered her head and with a lost gaze mentioned the name Sarika. Upon hearing this, Cyan started observing her and began thinking silently. She raised her head and with tears in her eyes, she asked our boy to tell Sarika that she had been wrong. For her this was painful, so she asked him to end this as soon as possible. Cyan extended his hand toward her and her body began to transform into fog. The gaze of our boy fixed on her. No one could predict their own downfall, and this was something that had also happened to him.